Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie from Democracy Tomorrow. We're back today with a very special guest, just a couple of days before the UN Charter turns 80 years of age. And by chance, the guest we have today, Professor Manfred Nowak from Austria, who's speaking to us from Venice in Italy, also has a birthday that he shares with the UN Charter. So happy birthday almost to Manfred. Happy birthday to the Charter. And with that, I'd like to welcome Manfred Nowak here today on Democracy Tomorrow. Manfred, how's life treating you?
Hi, Scott, and I'm very grateful to be on this podcast. Yeah, life has changed a lot, but still, I'm feeling very well. I'm feeling very optimistic despite all the difficulties we have, and I'm happy to discuss with you my academic human rights life, my practitioner's life, and whatever you are interested in.
Well, you've had probably around 50 years or even maybe more working directly in the human rights field since you got your law degree all those years ago. And so maybe just give us a quick overview of some of the highlights, and then we can sort of delve into the feelings of each era as they came about.
Yeah, I mean, I graduated from high school in 1968. I avoided military service, which was not that easy for me. So I was early and I was very quick with my law studies. I did also other studies, political economy, sales and advertising and this kind of things. Um, and I graduated in 4 years, so actually in 1972. So I started in 68. I feel a little bit like a 68 generation. I have been in 67 on a hitchhiking tour in London, enjoying kind of the hippie life in London. And that was one of my main passions in life is traveling. So I did with my first wife, we did all kind of hitchhiking tours to the North Cape, to the whole Turkey and to the Syrian border and back to Morocco, etc. And I did also later, I did two more or less 1 year tours by Volkswagen vans through all Latin America, down from New York to Chile and Argentina, and another one with friends later, more or less 1 year through the Sahara and then to West Africa and East Africa. And I'm telling that because that was really my passion, getting to know other countries, other cultures, other people to understand better, in particular the global South. And that's why I was very much involved in development cooperation. I started an information group on Latin America, left wing, periodically to tell the other story, not the business story, but what is really going on in Latin America in terms of US dependence and exploitation and military dictatorships, etc. So that was the one side. But I studied law, and at the end of my studies, I met and was a scholar and a student of the pioneer of human rights in Austria, Felix Elmacora, who at that time was member of the working group in South Africa, of the one on Chile. He later became special rapporteur on Afghanistan. He was chair of the Human Rights Commission. He did the Greek case. So whatever. So that was very inspiring for me. And that's why soon after I graduated, it was 22, I had my PhD, 72, my PhD in 73 already, started while I was working at the university, constitutional administrative law, and already very much on human rights. And then in 74, I did, with a Fulbright scholarship, a 1 year Master of Law at Columbia University. And that was really opening my my mind also, not only about the totally different teaching. Lou Hankin was my hero at Columbia, but I had many others like Delford Taylor, who opened me the archive of the Nuremberg trial at Columbia University, and I did also a paper on torture in the Nazi time and in the Soviet Union. But that was for me extremely important for my later life. So probably Lou Henkin inspired me even more to really get deep into human rights than Felix Emakour, but both of them were essential. And then afterwards, I wrote my what we call habilitation. That is a very German, Austrian thing. In order to become a professor, you need to not only have a PhD, but a little bit more, write a big book. And it took me about 10 years to do that. But for that, I again was spending a lot of time in London at the London School of Economics, in Bielefeld in Germany, in Amsterdam actually at the Europe Institute, in Geneva. That's where I started to get to know the United Nations, the International Commission of Jurists, and then for me. The academic work and the activist work became much more closer related to human rights, but in particular human rights in the global south. And that was the 80s when I also started to really follow every meeting of the newly established Human Rights Committee. So I became a real specialist on the Human Rights Committee and was writing in the Human Rights Law Journal and other periodicals, and later writing my first German commentary on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And that brought me much closer into the treaty body system, but also I was invited to serve as a member of the Austrian delegation to the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations in 1986. And that brought me really into the United Nations. But before I was then moving to the Netherlands, and that's where we got to know each other. That I was appointed in 1987 as director of the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights at Utrecht University, and that was for me very strange because there were so many famous human rights specialists in the Netherlands, and I am an Austrian, so why did they choose me? And but I did speak already Dutch. I was married at that time with a Dutch woman. I had studied in Amsterdam, so I was very happy to do that, and that brought me into this world of human rights institutes. At that time, the Netherlands Institute was one of the pioneers in actually combining human rights with development cooperation, because the institute was funded by development cooperation funds in order to assess the human rights situation in priority countries of their development cooperation. And the same happened in the Nordic countries, in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Finland. So we had a close cooperation between the Nordic institutes, later leading to the establishment of the Association of Human Rights Institutes 2000 in Reykjavik, which is now the biggest network of human rights research and education, research and documentation centers. And on the other hand, I, as I said, entered more and more the United Nations, became an expert on the working group on enforced disappearances in former Yugoslavia, and later then drafted or helped to draft the Convention on Enforced Disappearances in poverty reduction strategies and special rapporteur on torture. So I had between 1993 and I think very recently, when I was leading the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, I had always some kind of mandates from the United Nations next to my academic career, and that was always at universities. I was long time teaching at the Austrian Academy of Public Administration, civil servants. That is also for me, police, but also other civil servants, was also a very important kind of way of getting to know how politics and administration is functioning. I had in Lund a year an Olof Palme chair at Lund University and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights, later at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, a Swiss chair, and then an Austrian chair at Stanford University. So I was also moving to different universities, but my main university was Vienna University. And last, and then I stop already, in 1992, I established with Felix Amakora still and Hannes Stretter the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights in Vienna, which was linked but not part of the university. And 4 months later, Christian Strohal, the Austrian ambassador for the World Conference on Human Rights, asked me whether I would be willing with the Boltzmann Institute to coordinate the non-governmental organizations coming to the Vienna World Conference in June 1993, and that was a more or less impossible task, but a big challenge. And I think we were finally successful because non-governmental organizations, and in particular those of women, were very, very instrumental in making the World Conference on Human Rights a success story. I leave it here, but it was a very short overview of my kind of practical and academic life.
Very short overview. Yeah, well, it reminds me, I forgot about that, but you just reminded me that your role at the World Conference on Human Rights was massive. And in fact, I can honestly say to people watching this podcast that I think I've honestly never seen somebody work harder or longer hours in such a frenzy as you did in the run up, and particularly during those meetings. Like, I could not believe how busy you were. You must have had 100 meetings every day at least. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the result of that meeting was quite substantial. And, coming only 4 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and suddenly all these forces which were held in check by the Cold War were suddenly allowed to be released, almost like a genie out of a bottle that had been kept in the bottle ever since 1945. And that's, a little bit before that is when we first met, I guess in the late 80s in Utrecht. It would have been at the Netherlands Institute of Human Rights, SIM as it's called in Dutch. And coming of age at that time within the human rights world, for all of us that were like, let's say within 10 or 20 years of each other, it was, without us knowing it even at the time, or even really realizing it until many years later, incredible good fortune, because it was a fundamentally different way of engaging with human rights compared to all the years previous, where it was kind of a peripheral issue. You always had to juggle the interests of the West versus the interests of the East. You had to take into account all these other political things. And then suddenly the cap was off the bottle, the genie was out, and it was really as if the sky was the limit. And, I worked a little bit in the academic sphere. I mean, I wrote lots of books and taught law school and things like that, but I was mostly an activist. You were mostly an academic and a UN official. And I know certainly for us, and, those overlap a lot when it comes to the inner day-to-day workings that nobody knows about unless you work at the UN. But, from the activist perspective, it was as if we had been given the key to the chocolate factory. We could do anything we wanted all of a sudden. And because there was such a lack of certainty by states, by governments about what to do, what was this new era we were entering, most of the time they didn't really even know what was going on, particularly the Eastern European and former Soviet Union states. Nobody knew what was going on and what was possible. So, we filled the gap. And a lot of human rights academics filled the gap, and all sorts of human rights gaps were filled, and all sorts of, new initiatives took off. And one of those in particular was a field that we both worked in, the whole field of economic, social, and cultural rights, the the right not to be poor, essentially, the right to have a house, the right to have healthcare and clothing and food, and the right to form trade unions and all of that. And one of the things also that we worked on, remember, in 1997 were the Maastricht guidelines on violations of economic, social, and cultural rights. And, most people have never heard of that either. But, it was already monumental that at the time, I remember when I first entered the human rights sphere, like in mid 80s in Geneva, I went up to people like Neil McDermott, the head of the International Commission of Jurists, one of the great human rights guys. And I said, I've got a paper for you on violations of the right to adequate housing. Would you publish it for me? And he just laughed at me. He's like, you can't violate that right, So that's the level we were starting with when it came to these economic, social, and cultural rights. So, I remember that very vividly, us drafting those guidelines in this side room off the main meeting room in Maastricht, and Kees Flinterman was there, and Theo van Boven was there, and all sorts of other officials were there. And I think it's interesting for people to hear, as we were talking before we started recording, I think both of us probably agree, but I'd love to get your deeper thoughts on this. If we were to have been asked in 1987, or let's say 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, what do you expect the human rights world to look like in 35 years, in 2025? I know I would have said that the situation would have been infinitely better than it actually is now. That international law would be taken far more seriously than it is now. There would be far less conflict. There would be far greater equality. There would be just infinitely better conditions on the ground than we see. And I think this is something that a lot of people in the human rights community are grappling with now. Kind of what happened, and where do we go from here in a world where international law is taken less and less seriously?
Yeah, let me perhaps go a little bit back. In retrospective, I must say that the Cold War was not that bad. We had all those battles. So when the United States or Western European countries widely accused the Soviet Union and the other communist states in Europe of violating freedom of religion, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, or whatever, the Soviets were saying, yes, that might be true, but you are violating the right to housing, the right to healthcare, or you have all the homeless people. And so it was kind of because they had totally different ideas of what human rights actually are. Despite the fact that in the Universal Declaration, there was a synthesis between the Western and the socialist, and to some extent also the Southern ideas of human rights, but that was stopped by the Americans in 1951 when they decided in the General Assembly, with a very, very tiny minority, that there should be not one human rights convention, but two human rights covenants, because they said economic, social, cultural rights are not really human rights, so we have to treat them differently. And that's why the implementation mechanisms and the state obligations under the two covenants are totally different. But nevertheless, it was possible to draft and adopt as binding most of the core human rights treaties on racial discrimination against women, on the rights of the child, against torture, on the rights of migrant workers, that were all drafted and adopted until the end of the Cold War. So 1989 was for me an amazing experience to see, and I was also involved in these Helsinki committees that were established after the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. We are celebrating 50 years of that, or commemorating more, because the OSCE is more or less dead. But at that time, the Helsinki Committee, civil society, had a major impact on the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc. So this was a short but a very promising window of opportunity. 1989, the end of the Cold War. Now we will be able finally to establish this new world order, which in Article 28 of the Universal Declaration was promised to everybody, where civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights would be implemented for everybody around the world. All human rights for all. That was our slogan at the NGO forum at the World Conference on Human Rights. So that was also the reason why we were preparing for the World Conference. Now is a new era, and we need a new kind of commitment to human rights. And we got it actually in the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. However, 1989 was also the year when the World Wide Web was invented, and we wouldn't have imagined what digitalization would actually mean in practice. If we look today at social media, at fake news, artificial intelligence, whatever. And even more detrimental was the Washington Consensus, which was also in 1989, where finally the international financial institutions, under the pressure of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and those who were already implementing neoliberal policies of deregulation, privatization, and minimizing the role of the state, were now prompting the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to apply purely neoliberal policies. And in my opinion, that is the main reason for the current state where we are. Deregulating the global financial markets meant a total chaos, leading to the 2008 financial and immobilian crisis, etc. But also, I mean, the Club of Rome that started in 1972 already talking about the limits of growth, and that we have to be aware that we cannot go on like this if we want to save the planet. And we are now in the biggest triple planetary crisis because nobody listened, and it's even getting worse. They are still investing in fossil fuels, although everybody knows that that is the main driver for climate change, etc. So I think the neoliberal economic system, for me, is not only the reason for the power of transnational corporations, now in particular in the IT sector, but also for the extremely fast rising economic inequality. Inequality of income, inequality of wealth. Thomas Piketty, in his Capital in the 21st Century, had the most comprehensive database on showing that during 1945 and 1975, so after World War II, in those 30 years, we had a very high economic growth in Europe, but under policies of John Maynard Keynes, meaning avoiding unemployment and redistribution, we had even in the United States, but also in Western Europe, progressive income tax up to 90%. In Sweden, even economic inequality was going down on the Gini coefficient. So, but in the other countries, it remained more or less the same. And then we see a steep rise going up to from 25 to 50. And that's what he said was about the inequality that the UK had at the high time of industrialization in the late 19th century, leading to World War I. So his main conclusion is, at a certain level, economic inequality is undermining the social cohesion of societies and undermining the democratic power, the democratic consensus, solidarity that we need in order to live together. We are now much more atomized, individualistic. There's no more solidarity. That leads to populism, that leads to polarization. And we see that not only in the United States of America, we see it in many Western European countries, that this polarization destroys democracies, and it's only money that counts and egoism. So we have taken over the competitiveness from business, the winner takes it all, to the democratic and political competitiveness. The other political parties are no longer competitors, they are enemies, they need to be destroyed. And that leads to authoritarianism. And we have, according to the Economist, we have about 7.8% of all states or all people living around the world are living in well-functioning democracies. That means more than 90% live in illiberal democracies and I think 38% in total dictatorship. So that is for me a very, very dangerous development to destroy democracy because human rights need to be based on a well-functioning democracy because most human rights obligations are positive obligations, both in civil and political rights, but also in economic, social, and cultural rights. You need to create the conditions, the legal and political conditions that everybody can enjoy liberal democracy, but also social democracy. A last point on the Vienna Declaration Program of Action, we were fighting to that for a very long time. We said all human rights for all, and that meant that those who were challenging the universality of human rights, China and certain Islamic states, had to accept that human rights are universal. But in order to achieve that, the Western states had to accept that all human rights are independent, interrelated, and equal. And that means that economic, social, and cultural rights are as important as civil and political rights. And both sides simply didn't comply with that. The United States has still not ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, doesn't, not even the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because it contains economic, social, and cultural rights. And of course, China is still talking about Asian values, and it's a Western human rights, a Western construct. It's not a universal system, although it is, in my opinion, the only universally accepted value system of our times. There's no state in the world, including North Korea, including Eritrea, Turkmenistan, the kind of diverse countries, that wouldn't have ratified at least 5 of the core human rights treaties of the United Nations. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is ratified more or less universally, with the only exception of the US. So it is recognized by states, but even more by civil society. So no religion, no ideology can claim to be really a universally recognized value system.
Yeah, that's very right. And well, I mean, let's pick apart some of these points. Well, first of all, the neoliberal economic order, the Washington Consensus that came about in the late 1980s. I mean, you've hit the nail perfectly on the head. Um, I think that that process, driven largely by the United States, but with Western backing as well, was one of many possible permutations of the way the world could have gone in an economic direction at the time. But they chose the most sort of extreme form of capitalism at the time. And there was a hunger for that came from Eastern Europe once it was finally so-called liberated. And they were deeply materialistic in their objectives. And then, China came along and they began supporting it as well with their whole "it is glorious to get rich" credo. And before you knew it, we had one ideological structure at the international level, at the economic level, which was that. And yes, that has made a lot of people rich. It's pulled a number of people out of the depths of poverty, but at the same time, it's created greater inequality than I believe has ever been measured. And with a concentration of wealth at the top of the financial pyramid that requires not just another brick on the top of the pyramid, but in fact a lightning rod that reaches much higher than the pyramid itself to graphically show the concentration of wealth at that ultra high level where the 2,900 billionaires now on planet Earth, between them, depends on who you believe, but it's 20, 40, who knows how much percent of the entire global economy is in their hands and their hands alone. And very little has been done to counter that phenomenon. States are reluctant to carry out taxation policies sufficiently. The international economic system is ordered in such a way that if one state does tax the wealthiest at levels that we used to accept as completely routine, let's say 50%. When I lived in Holland, even if you were poor like me, you paid 50% tax and no one questioned it. Now, billionaires are angry if they pay more than 4%. And if a country says, well, you're going to pay 5, they will flee that jurisdiction and go to some no tax or low tax environment, of which there are countless numbers. There's a grab bag of options they can choose tomorrow. They can also change their nationality like that and pay for it for free. Citizenship is available to everybody if you have the sufficient funds to pay for it. So we have this real evolution of the world, moving away from the central feature of human rights being the essence of what it means to be a citizen into, well, if you can pay for it, you can acquire it, and no questions asked. And that is, of course, going to reach a dead end at some point in time, and it feels like we're not that far from that dead end, where the gap between the rich and poor is so huge, the non-enjoyment of human rights is so huge, the scale of democracies versus non-democracies is so huge that something's going to have to give. So, from our perspective, Democracy Tomorrow, we think that one of the ways to use what we would easily classify as a crisis time now, the triple threat that you were mentioning before with climate change and all the other factors that are truly global in nature, we can either choose to conserve what we have in terms of the human rights treaties and all of the international laws that we have. Again, reminding people that the UN Charter turns 80 in 2 days. Or we can go completely backwards and just, allow an authoritarian world to emerge, or we can do the third way, which has never been tried before, which is where we make the quantum leap, the quantum evolutionary leap in our minds that many of us have already made, to a truly global structure where the human being is the basis of whatever model we decide to construct. Nationality is not the basis of it. Your citizenship is not the basis of it. Our shared humanity is. A world of world citizens, essentially. Now, this is seen by many people as pie in the sky, esoteric, dreamland, extremist, lefty, you name it. But, my take is, as an international human rights lawyer and a practitioner for 40 years, is that the entire human rights system, really, without saying it so clearly, is actually based on that premise. It's based on the fact that no matter where you're born, no matter who your parents were, what religion you are, you have the very same rights as me, because human rights are universal. That is a widely accepted concept. So the leap from that to world citizen is not all that huge, right? So, if we had to predict, and predictions are, very hard, particularly about the future, as some comedian once said, um, if we had to predict where things would be if we were asked in 1990 where they are today, I think we would have both been very wrong. Um, at least I know I would have been. I would have been much more hopeful. But let's try to do a prediction now. 2025, in 2050, what do you think is the most realistic scenario when it comes to the global international order, human rights, the basic condition of humans? What's the most hopeful vision you have, and what do you think is the most realistic vision, if you dare make a prediction?
Uh, if we go on as we did, the most realistic vision would be there are no more democracies, there's no more United Nations or other international organizations. It's the rule of the jungle. And that means what we see now, the ones who have the strongest military and economic power are the ones ruling the world. Since autocratic regimes tend more to fight wars than democratic regimes and do much less to eradicate hunger, poverty, starvation, we will have even more economic inequality, and the big majority of the poor people around the world are simply forgotten and left on their own. That might be and at the same time we are exploiting Mother Earth, and we will create conditions that make our planet more and more unlivable, apart from the few rich who always can go to those places that are still kind of, from a climate perspective and a biodiversity perspective, still the most livable places on Earth. Having said that,
Sorry to interrupt. What can we actually do to try to push things in the other direction, because I mean, people that are knowledgeable understand the scale of the climate crisis. They understand the scale of the nuclear problem. They understand the scale of global poverty, of all of the major overarching problems in the world: dictatorship, autocracy, nationalism. But what can we really do that hasn't already been done? I mean, what's the missing link, do you see, that people could really put their energies into, particularly younger people who are 20 now and 25, who are just starting their careers? And, I teach a lot of kids that are that age. And it's really, it's a 50-50 thing. Some are extremely hopeful and still ready to fight for justice. Others have kind of given up, and they're just throwing in the towel and saying, forget it. I'm too depressed about this situation. I'm just going to go party until I can't party anymore. But what can we do? I mean, obviously there's a million things that are on the table.
Yeah, but I think as more this scenario is becoming a highly probable scenario, I think there will be a change, and in particular in the younger generation, the kids. I have a lot of trust in kids. They started with Fridays for Future, with Black Lives Matter, with the last generation, etc., and they were all met with so much resistance by the system. But at a certain point, and I really hope that we don't need a third world war, a nuclear world war, in order to change thinking. In the past, that was the case. We needed the Second World War in order to turn the League of Nations into a functioning United Nations, in order to really say human dignity, human rights. They were trapped, they were violated in the most horrific way by the Nazis, but also by Stalinism. One of the three main aims and objectives of the United Nations. We need prosperity, we need peace, and we need human rights. So there will be a certain point, and I hope that we are not too far away from this point, that people realize, no, we cannot go on like this. But that needs a kind of a revolution, and that is the difficult kind of part of it, because one state, not even a group of states like the European Union, is able to really achieve this change. You need to start really taxing the rich, but that can only be done if we all work together. So I think we have the United Nations, and I think the United Nations in principle are a very good organization. I have a lot of criticism. We need to change the Security Council. We need to change many other things. But above all, we need to change the governance of the international financial institutions. They have a lot of power. If they all of a sudden turn from a neoliberal economic policy to a policy, economic policy, that is really interfering with this politics. Now, politics are run by the economy, but we need to turn back that the economy is run by politics, is regulated by politics. I think if you do that at a global level, then you can achieve a lot. Whether this is immediately a world state with world citizens and getting away from the Westphalian model, that is for me a far kind of, and I fully agree with you, in principle we all should be equal wherever we are born, but that would also mean unrestricted global migration, and of course the poor are migrating more to the rich countries, so the rich areas then of the world state. So I think for some time we need still the nation state, but in a much more equal way of governing the United Nations. The United Nations need to be strengthened, also in budgetary means, very much with a major. So we could start with a conference on reforming the United Nations, but there must be the political will among political leaders. And that's the problem in the moment with the decline of democracy. it's not no longer attractive to become a politician. So many politicians who come from business leave again because they say the political system is crazy. I mean, I admire actually people who have ideas, who have visions, and who remain in politics in the way it is now, because it is such a kind of competitive politics that whatever you do, you are criticized. We need to get away from that. We need to say the common good, that we all work together for a better world. I think it is possible, and I think children can show us in which direction that might go. I know it sounds in a moment very naive or highly optimistic, but I think it's the only way out. If we realize we cannot go on like this, then I think we need to stand together. And I think currently with the money that is available around, if you only take the 1,000 richest people in the world, and you really take away, you can only take away half of their fortune, what they have. You can already eradicate a lot of poverty around the world if you do it. But we need strong political leaders to do that. We need to strengthen the United Nations. And I think that the European Union, if it overcomes its internal kind of problems, can take a lead, because it is still, compared to the United States, somehow democratically ruled and based on the rule of law and democratic values. So we are less far in the decline of democracy as the US are. But I mean, there might also be a time after Trump, and perhaps also in the United States, people realize you cannot run your country and at the same time the world simply by chuck decisions. And I do it as I just wake up and who was my last advisor who told me something that I do today and tomorrow I do something else. That's not how you can run politics in times of deep economic, ecological and other crises. So I do have the hope. I think, I mean, my current job is I'm Secretary General of the Global Campus of Human Rights, which is the largest institution in postgraduate human rights education. So I think with human rights education, you can do a lot. If all our graduates, we have more than 5,000, are human rights ambassadors all over the world, I think we should also follow the obligation of states to introduce human rights education in all their learnings, from kindergarten, primary school, high school, up to universities and lifelong learning. It's an obligation under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Declaration on Human Rights Training and Teaching, whatever. So we need to implement that. If we start from kids to explain to them that human rights is this kind of value system that is based on respect for each other, based on all those different freedoms and a better world, then I think children are also in a better way educated to become the leaders for a different world in the future.
Right, very correct. And back to the point you mentioned about um well, let's put it this way. Is it possible to envisage a new movement, a new political movement based on the reality of the situation in the world today? I believe reasonably minded people who care about the human race, people who don't want human suffering, people who don't want war or nuclear weapons are in the huge majority of the planet's population. The people that benefit from poverty and from violence and from extreme concentration of wealth are really a small number of people compared to the vast majority of others. So in a way, you could argue we have the numbers. So how do we take advantage of having the numbers? Now, with some scenario like there's a lot of discussion at the international level. It's somewhat esoteric, but it's also real. States are considering this, the idea of setting up a parliamentary people's assembly, essentially, in parallel with the General Assembly of States, where you'd have individual people representing the masses or the peoples of the United Nations, as the Charter says, running things in a parallel manner with the General Assembly, which is comprised of 193 nation states. What if we had that combined with some sort of new movement? I'm just thinking about the like-minded states movement of the 1970s, which was largely Scandinavia and Holland and a couple of others, which were extremely progressive countries in the human rights and international development domain, and who pursued jointly policies of a similar nature. So how about a grouping of states now, the strong democracy believers, the save the planet believers, the people that are on the side of the international rule of law and the international legal order as it is envisaged. And if they were to group together loosely, not disassociating themselves with the UN in any way, but sort of beginning the process of linking arms and saying, this is the vision that we have for our planet, not one of autocracy, not one of dictatorship, not one of the end of the UN, but something better and bolder that indeed, and you made the perfect point, we must, as a species, have reached the level of evolution where we don't need a world war prior to developing something better than what we already have. As has been proven to us twice, it should never, ever take that in order for us to realize the scale of the problem. You and I and millions of others know perfectly well what the problems are. It's not a mystery. We don't need to do any more research. We know what's going on. But we don't, there's not enough organized political will to push us to that next level. And, I think something needs to be found, some secret sauce, so to speak, needs to be put out there that everyone can rally around, that actually lasts longer and is more substantial than than the important, but nonetheless small and largely short-lived movements of the last few years. The Climate Fridays movement of Greta Thunberg, and you said Black Lives Matter. There was the Occupy movement. There's been a lot of these short-lived movements which all have more or less the same objective. The fighting oligarchy movement now by Bernie Sanders and co. in the United States, and a whole range of others. But I believe something new needs to come onto the scene, which everyone who's reasonable can gather around. And, maybe it needs to be based on, I can't remember which indigenous group in the United States it is. I think it's the Cherokee, but I'm not sure. But they said we make no decision without considering its impact 7 generations from now. That sort of mentality needs to, take hold and become, the normal way of viewing things. The normal way should not be, pulling oil out of the ground simply because we can, or cutting trees down in jungles because we can, and polluting because we can, and consuming because we can. It has to be something based upon, preserving the incredible good fortune that we have of being alive at all. The miracle of life on this planet. People forget about it. People completely ignore these basic fundamental tenets of life, and which I'm sure you would totally agree with. And we're not flaky weirdo people. It's just the miracle of human beings existing at all should be enough to drive us to find solutions where we can all work together. Because I believe all of us are better off when all of us enjoy human rights.
I fully agree with you. I think on 2 levels. And one is the state level. I think it's high time, and again, the European Union could take the lead of reaching out to the Global South. We have this very unfortunate BRICS versus the West, and BRICS Plus now. I think we should find those democratic states in the Global South that are willing to cooperate with the democratic states in the Global North, whether it's Brazil, whether it's South Africa, whether it's India. I think of course, they all have their problems, as the democratic states in the Global North have their problems with right-wing extremism, etc. But still to say, we need to work together and forget this stupid North-South kind of war on cultures, etc. That's the one thing. Against democracies, against authoritarian regimes. And the other one is what you call the People's Assembly of World Citizens. I think the big majority of human beings around this planet want a peaceful and a prosperous world, and a world where they can survive in terms of climate and environment. However, also because of this polarization that we are living in, also the civil society is totally polarized. And that we have to overcome that, saying we have to find what combines us and not what separates us. Identity politics have a very negative effect. I do understand them and I support them to some extent, but they have a very negative effect on the polarization. And many left-wing groups, if you now think about all the different wars, have all different ways of only engaging themselves for the Palestinians, but not for the Ukrainians, and whatever, and vice versa. So I think we need also in the peace movement, the ecological movement, and the human rights movement are very, very closely related to each other, but they have to work together. So I think to establish something, and that would be another chamber. You have the General Assembly with states, and I think we need to keep it. It's a democratic way. Every state has one vote in the General Assembly. And then we need to have a citizens' assembly, which is where children should also be allowed to vote and to be elected. And at the beginning, that needs to be done on, again, a state-based level. So a little bit similar like the elections to the European Parliament. But it shouldn't be only politicians that are elected. It should be civil society leaders. And if such a movement would be possible also within the United Nations, you don't even have to change in the moment already the UN Charter. That is something we can do. The General Assembly can actually take a decision to create that, and a citizens' assembly. But in the long time, we need to change the Charter of the United Nations already, because of we need to change the composition of the Security Council and really develop a well-functioning global and universal security system. That was the original idea as a collective security system of the United Nations. I think this would be an important first step, which might also then develop new leaders, people who coming from civil society with great ideas are becoming leaders that are recognized within the overall United Nations system in order to change things. The third one is that we need also to somehow include the corporate sector. The corporate sector is extremely powerful, and we cannot simply deny it and only by high taxes and whatever. So the corporate sector, and there are many transnational corporations who in principle feel a certain responsibility for the environment, but also for human rights. And we still do not have a binding treaty on how this transnational corporations should actually comply with human rights and ecological standards, do a human rights impact assessment and ecological impact assessment, etc. And the EU has done quite a lot with the corporate sustainability Triple D directive, because so that would have been a big step. Unfortunately, now with the new European Parliament and then the new Commission, They try to destroy all that. So we need to establish that at the United Nations level. And we have a working group already for quite some time developing a treaty on corporate sustainability and responsibility. So I think that would also be as perhaps a third chamber. You have the General Assembly of States, you have a chamber of transnational corporations, but those who are willing and enter into obligations to comply with environmental and human rights standards, and a citizen assembly as the three main global organizations within the United Nations. And then we need a bigger Security Council without the veto right of one state, but a kind of a qualified majority, and a standing United Nations armed force, whether it's a rapid prevention force, a rapid reaction force, but we need a standing UN military if we wanted a collective security system that is primarily aimed at preventing armed conflicts should actually work.
Absolutely. And, I mean, people won't realize this who aren't involved in the international scene, but the very first major international organization after the First World War was the International Labor Organization, which is still there. 1919, Treaty of Versailles set it up. They had a tripartite structure from the beginning where they recognized that states were equal to employers, so companies, who are equal to trade unionists. So the principle is already there. It's been there for more than 100 years. But I think you're very right. We really need to re-energize the UN with brand new ideas. Maybe the next Secretary General will do something like this too, who will, in all likelihood, as far as I hear, will be a woman for the very first time. I think out of 9 Secretary Generals, there hasn't been a woman yet, so it's highly likely that they will elect a woman. But something new needs to happen at that level, taking into account like all of the stuff that we're thinking of. And I mean, I'm sure states will never, because states, the very matter of states existing means that those working for that state think of nothing other than preserving that state. It's built in. You can't think about other countries or the rest of humanity if your whole purpose is to preserve the integrity of a particular state. So states are not going to, by their very nature, walk away from the power that they're accorded at the Security Council. But in a dream world, I think a whole new system could be simply a lottery system, a random choice of, let's say, whatever, 17 highly knowledgeable people who are taken out of a hat once a year. And those people are the ones that represent humanity and try to do everything possible to preserve international peace and security, and not a state that repeatedly vetoes a resolution on Ukraine because they're Russia, or vetoes a resolution on Israel because they're the United States. It's a system that's completely flawed by its very essence. And I understand why they had to do it in 1945. I understand the motivations behind it. We all do. But clearly, after 80 years, I think the whole international peace and security structure, of course, needs to remain in place, but it needs to be improved and shaken up a little bit. So I guess where can we end this tonight? Well, let's hope that, as you said before, that the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter in 2 days can be used as a stepping stone to something better, something bigger that does not require all of humanity blowing each other's heads off before we come to our senses. We must have evolved that far now on this planet. So many of us have traveled to other countries now. So many. Never before in human history have more people met people from other countries than ever before. Never before in human history have people eaten foods from other countries than ever before. Never before in human history have people understood and learned about the religions of other people in other cultures than ever before. Never have we been able to pick up our phone and be able to access every piece of information ever developed by our species in one split second. We're at an extraordinary place in human history. We need to harness those energies and really start coming together as one unified humanity and push together and try to find a better way than the world that confronts us now, because it's very hard to be hopeful in the world as it is. So any last thoughts for today? Any hopeful last thoughts, Manfred? Oh, I know. What about what words of advice can you give to young people that are thinking about entering the world of human rights, the world of international law, the world of making the world a better place in 2025? What real good life advice can you give them?
First of all, I fully agree with what you just said, and I also don't want to be understood as not seeing the positive sides of the recent developments in terms of prosperity, in terms of digitalization. There are so many opportunities that we have. Also, to some extent, poverty could be reduced in China, in India, etc. So there were positive developments as well. Not everything is bad about the current capitalist system. It only is exploding in a way that destroys democracy. So we need to not abolish it. I'm not talking about a new communism, not abolish it, but regulate it in a reasonable manner and hold transnational corporations accountable. I think that's the main thing. And for children and young people, I mean, we at the Global Campus of Human Rights, we created what we call a child leadership team. And these are kids between 12 and 18 years old whom we recruited. We have 8 regions where we have master programs. And from all 8 regions, we recruited those kids and brought them together, primarily online. Sometimes they were also invited to events. And then we said we do every year a big international conference of the Global Campus of Human Rights, bringing all different regions together on a particular topic. And we told the child leadership team, but you are deciding what's the topic. And it took them, I think, a month or so. They had very, very controversial kind of discussions, and I thought they would certainly say it will be climate change or so. But they came up with, let's make a conference on mental health. We were all surprised, but it showed that these young kids have such a strong feeling of responsibility that we are living in a time when, whether it was COVID-19, whether it's the rising danger of armed conflicts, whether it's poverty, whether it's this whole insecurity, we don't know where the world is going in the next 5 years, is creating major stress and mental health problems. And we did a conference on mental health. And now these young kids are growing older. So we have a youth advisory group, people between 19 and 24. And we're recruiting new kids. They are agents on their own. They know exactly what they are talking about. We should, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is in Article 12, one of the most provisions is listen to children, take their views seriously in all areas that directly affect them. Let them participate in decision making. I would lower the age of the voting age much further down. Include children as early as possible in the shaping of a future world. Perhaps we could also have, we were talking about a citizen assembly, we could have a youth assembly also in the United Nations to really listen to the voices of children where they feel that things need to be changed, but then also taking them seriously in the political decision making that will come. If we do that, I am optimistic that it's not too late to save our world for also children and future generations. We have the Maastricht Principles on the rights of future generations, which is a very important document. And we should even go further. We should also recognize nature as a rights holder. Future generations need to be represented by some kind of ombudsperson. why not also representing animals and nature as such? So we should not only protect nature because we want to enjoy nature, but we should protect nature for its own sake. And that would also be a big step in our human rights thinking and development for the future.
Absolutely. Very well put. I don't know if you've read this book ever. Have you heard of this book, The Ministry for the Future? You should put it
Uh,
you
yeah,
should
I
put it
have.
on your list. Put it on your list for summer reading in Europe if you haven't read it already, because it's one of the most positive. In a way, it's what we were talking about today. The UN sets up this thing called the Ministry for the Future, and it actually succeeds. So it succeeds in doing all the things that we want to, but with some, dodgy methodologies. But yeah, it is the planet. It's the children's planet from now on, and we do need to engage and involve them. And in the end, everybody in trying to organize ourselves not along the lines of our differences, but on the countless more things that we share. And it's as simple as that, if you ask me. The things that we share as humans are infinitely larger in number than the things we don't. So let's get back to that, find the similarities, stand with each other, stand in each other's shoes when we need to, and, push things hopefully in the right direction so that Manfred and I can retire with smiles on our faces instead of frowns, just for that reason alone. So, Manfred, thank you so much for talking to us today at Democracy Tomorrow. That was Professor Manfred Nowak, everybody, who was with us today, speaking from the Lido in Venice, where he luckily works for him. This is Democracy Tomorrow. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest episode. Please join us again then. Thanks very much for watching. Take care. Bye.